Hello, everybody. It is 9 o'clock on Saturday night. My name is Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. I have behind the scenes Lissa, but I am by myself otherwise. So Lissa's waving at all of us. So thank you, Lissa, for doing this, for her spending her Saturday night here. And I was thinking while I was going through the topic for today, we're going to talk about space-going aircraft carriers. And I was thinking about how this is a topic I keep coming back with on this show. And it's in part, it's because I keep having the opportunity to think deeper thoughts about it. And, you know, this is aircraft carriers in space is one of the first presentations I originally put together when I started going to science fiction conventions. It was, I think, the third one I put together. And I've probably done more work and more deep thoughts and formed new opinions and did more research, etc., on this since I started this show, so call it 3-4 years, than I did in the previous 15 years before that. Because I probably put this presentation together around 2007-ish. And so I've been doing it for about 18 years, maybe. There more or less. And I'd done some thinking about it beforehand because I started thinking about it when I was first at CNA. And so it was a natural thing for me to put together. CNA is Center for Naval Analysis, back when I was going out to sea on aircraft carriers. And so I started thinking about what the difference was between what an aircraft carrier does. And you've seen that talk before. And at some point, you're going to see the full up talk again, because I've done the full up talk, but the full up talk is different. The full up talk is now it's now structured as a 2-hour talk. It's going to turn into a 3-hour talk because I'm adding an entire hour on Battlestar Galactica, the Ron Moore version, and sort of how, because I think I can tell a pretty good story based upon what we see on screen and what we see in terms of the design of the ship. I can tell a story about what colonial fleet doctrine looks like. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. But before I get to the end, I'm going to talk about big versus small aircraft carriers. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and throw it up on stage. So here we go. So y'all should start thinking about questions you might have, because happy to answer questions. As always, I do not speak for my employer, and all images are held by the copyright owners. I'm not claiming copyright on any of these. I'm throwing images up because I will do my best to critique them and to use them for educational purposes. That's the reason why I use them. So let's talk about small versus large space-going aircraft carriers. So space-going carriers. And I'm going to talk, this is mostly about like how they work in the real world. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what those real world implications are for science fiction. But in the past, I haven't really talked about small versus large. I kind of have in the context of defining what an aircraft carrier is. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that. And some of this stuff is going to get rolled back into the presentation because I'm probably going to end up with 3 different versions of this presentation. One that's a 1-hour version, one that's a 2-hour version, and one that's a 3-hour version. And in the 3-hour version, some of the stuff that's in the first hour is going to move to the second hour. And some of the stuff that's currently in the second hour is going to move to the third hour. So this will be stuff that goes in that first hour where I talk about real world aircraft carriers. But before that, let's talk about the general agenda schedule thing coming forward. So this is not aircraft carriers in space revised. This is an input into aircraft carriers in space revised. But I do still want to do all these other topics, and I've got a much, much, much longer list of topics. In fact, I decided on this one because I was going through my list of topics. Part of the problem is, so this is part of the list. The flip side of that page is also a list of topics. And then I've got a separate list on my computer, and I'm trying to get it all in the computer. So I've got enough topics to continue doing the show for the next 4 years. If I never think of another idea, I can talk for 4 years. But here's sort of what I'm kind of thinking sooner rather than later in all of this. Now, that schedule, note the word probably there. So I thought about usually if I'm not sure, I color it orange, and I realize the entire schedule would be orange if I did that. So instead, I went ahead and used green and red, but note the probably, because what's going on here is sometime in the next 5 weeks, starting next week, I want to do 2 trips to Ohio to visit the Weuve Strategic Book Reserve and Game Library located at Beaver Valley Self-Storage in Fairborn, Ohio, or Beaver Creek, Ohio. I want to go visit my books and sort of prep them. That's the last part of the move I need to make. And I'm not going to do 2 weekends in a row. So it's not, so if I go one weekend, I know I'm going to do a show the next. I'm going to try to go next weekend. But it's the winter time, and weather prevented the last trip. So I was supposed to go last week. I ended up not going. I canceled at the last second and decided not to call an audible and try to do a show. And I canceled at the last second because the weather was so crappy in Ohio, and the weather was especially crappy in the mountains of Maryland, which I have to drive through to get to Ohio. And so the Ohio part would have just been really cold, but they didn't get nearly as much snow as they were predicting. Although, to paraphrase Ambrose Bierce, I did not have the outcome available to me when I made the decision. But it turns out Maryland, the mountains and the mountain passes and stuff were actually problematic, because I've got friends who live there and they said, yeah, it's really good you didn't come. So in any event, going to try to do that next week. If I make it to Ohio next week, then on the 3rd of January, I'll do a show. If I don't make it to Ohio next week, I will try to do a show. I will try to make it on the 3rd of January. So watch this space. I will be basically deciding probably around Wednesday if I'm going to do a show that week. And I'll try to make an announcement on YouTube, do a post on YouTube. So that's way more talking about the schedule. But let me emphasize some of the caveats. So I already gave you the one about the images being property. I haven't said this recently, so let me say it again. I was never in the Navy, but I spent a lot of time at sea in my former job. My knowledge is idiosyncratic, and it's definitely outdated by now. It's at least somewhat outdated, because I haven't been on an aircraft carrier since November of 2004. So it's been 20 years since I've been on an aircraft carrier. I've stood pierside and looked at aircraft carriers, but I haven't actually been on one in over 20 years. So, but the sort of things that I'm going to talk about are things that haven't changed. So this part hasn't changed. Okay, so here we go. Here's the agenda for today. I'm going to give you a few introductory thoughts. I'm going to talk about the salient features of a carrier. What do I mean when I say aircraft carrier? I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to include in this talk. And I got salient features of the carrier in there twice. I don't know why. I think it's because I move stuff around. I'm going to do a quick comparison. I'm going to give you some rules of thumb. I'm going to talk about some differences I haven't mentioned previously. And then I'm going to talk about the important part of this, which is space-going aircraft carriers. And if you've seen me talk about aircraft carriers before, you're going to recognize some of the stuff. Some of the words are going to be different, and the voiceover is going to be different, because I'm not going to go into the details of catabar capabilities versus stowbar capabilities, and I'm not going to get into all the details of where the mailroom is and all the other stuff. In the past, that's part of that other presentation. That's not relevant for this presentation. So a few introductory thoughts. One is that aircraft carriers have gotten bigger over time. If you look at a World War II aircraft carrier is the size of a small amphib today. World War II aircraft carriers might be 20,000 tons, 30,000 tons. I think towards the end, they got to 40,000 tons. An aircraft carrier today, a U.S. aircraft carrier, is 100,000 tons. So they're much, much, much bigger today than they were before. The United States Navy builds big carriers, 80-ish airplanes, 100,000 tons displacement. We aim for the high end. Now, you may hear the phrase lightning carrier every now and then. That is an amphib, which looks like a carrier. An LHD has a flat deck on the top. LHD, LHA. I can never keep those straight. I'm not really an amphib guy. Has a flat deck on the top, and they talk about turning them into lightning carriers by putting F-35s on them, and maybe they can use them like baby carriers. But they're going to have limitations, and we're going to talk about that. In fact, this is really kind of talking about the limitations of the big ones versus the small ones. There are occasionally proposals to build smaller carriers. Should we do that? So sometimes they talk about very small carriers, but usually they're talking about medium-sized carriers, like the size of the old Midway, which was about 60,000 tons. Carries about 55, 60 airplanes, as opposed to like the 80 to 100 that you can cram onto an aircraft carrier. No, we never send an aircraft carrier to sea with as many airplanes as you can fit on it, because you can think of it as like moving furniture around in your living room. If your living room is really, really crowded, it becomes really hard to move furniture around. If your living room is mostly empty, it's a piece of cake to move furniture around, right? But if it's really crowded, it becomes very difficult. You have to move this piece to move that piece to move the other piece to move this piece to move that piece. And that same thing is with airplanes. It's like, if the parking garage is full and you need to get a tow truck in there, it becomes very hard. But if there are no other cars there, it's easy, right? Same sort of deal. And then I'm going to talk about how all this affects the absolute most important question we can talk about today, which is how does this affect how we represent space-going aircraft carriers in fiction, in science fiction? So you can see here an example, which I just absolutely love this. I think it's very well done. It's a miniature model for a game from Brigade Models. It's intended to be used in a war game. And I just love it because it really gets across the idea of both it's a spacecraft and it's a carrier. So it's a fantastic model. Okay, so what am I not going to do on this? I'm not going to get into the question of whether nuclear carriers are worth it. I will say there's a couple of things we know, and this is based upon all the studies that have been done, including the 1998 GAO study, which is sort of one of the seminal studies. And the other one is all the work that the Center for Naval Analysis did for the analysis of alternatives for what turned into the Ford class. This was all done in the 2001 timeframe, 2002 timeframe. And I knew vaguely the author of that study. I'm not sure whether he knew my name. I knew him on site. I'm not sure if he knew my name. He was a guy at the Center for Naval Analysis, and so he did a lot of work on this and wrote some articles in U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings and in a few other places. And I reread a bunch of those articles in preparation for this. And so a lot of the information comes from those sources. When you compare nuclear versus conventional, the sortie rates are about the same, right, in terms of the number of sorties per day. You still have to do lots of underway replenishments because the air wing is incredibly thirsty, and that's what's going to use the bulk of your fuel. And so that drives the bulk of your fuel requirements. And so that drives the number of times you have to link up with a tanker and transfer fuel over. So it's really about transferring fuel to the air wing. It's not about transferring fuel to the transferring fuel for the ship. And, nuclear reactors are one of those things that don't scale down particularly well. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, the fuel thing is one of the reasons why Navy cruisers, nuclear cruisers didn't make a whole lot of sense. In the end, they concluded it wasn't worth the trouble. They're more expensive and they got more training and you have to pay bigger retention bonuses. And there's all these reasons why it's more expensive. And yeah, you don't have to unrep, but you still have to unrep if you're supporting the carrier. But when push comes to shove, the thing that in my mind really kind of convinced me that for a cruiser size ship, it probably wasn't worth using nuclear power is the fact that the reactor plant is a lot bigger than the engineering plant on a cruiser is. And so if you got two ships of the same displacement, one of them's nuclear powered, the other one isn't. It's got to come from somewhere. And where it usually comes from is the magazine. So you end up with a smaller magazine. Now, I'll note, last time we designed one of those ships was probably in the 1970s, I think. I don't think we designed one. In fact, I'm sure we didn't design one in the 80s. So the last time we designed one was probably the mid-1970s. And I don't know if it would change if we designed one today. I don't know if we could make the plant smaller. I don't know, etc. But this is all sort of a sidebar because none of that applies for aircraft carriers, because aircraft carrier plants are so big to get that big ship moving fast through the water that nuclear power is an economies of scale sort of thing. So it makes total sense for an aircraft carrier. So there's no performance difference when it comes to that, although nuclear power does let you go faster, longer if you need to. But, you know, we can have a discussion for another day as to how much you really need that capability, right? You know, wouldn't it be great if it could fly? Yeah, it would be great if it could fly. Do we need to spend the money to make it fly? No, we don't. So, you know, not every capability is automatically the right answer. Right Sublet says he's a big fan of the LM2500. So am I. That is the gas turbine that is used by most Navy vessels. It's got to be in its like 34th generation by now, because that engine actually, it's a jet engine that instead of using thrust out the back to propel the ship, instead is connected to a reduction gear through the shaft, and it turns a propeller. And that engine was originally a DC-10 engine, which will tell you exactly how old that engine design is. But, you know, it works for what they want to do with it. And I'm sure that if we pulled the thread on that, we would see all the differences between what the Navy is looking for in an engine and what an airliner is looking for in an engine. Like, for instance, high bypass ratios are something that don't make any sense for this, because you're not actually getting your thrust by moving air. You're getting your thrust by turning a gearbox. So and connecting it to a propeller. Let's see. Nukes are more expensive, but the Navy says they're worth it. Not going to get into the details of that. Nuclear costs are more predictable because, you know, they're consistently expensive, whereas fossil fuels can sometimes be cheaper and sometimes can be more expensive, and you're going to use a lot of fossil fuels over the life of the ship. But of course, the air wing's going to dominate that, as I said previously. I'm not going to get into all the details of what a carrier does, like all the other missions it does, command and control, et cetera, et cetera. Watch the previous video for that, or wait until I do it again. And I'm not going to do a detailed analysis of carrier survivability, right? Can you defend the carrier? For purposes of this discussion, I don't care if you can defend it. I don't care if it's survivable. Not going to go there. Okay, so what do I mean when I say aircraft carrier? An aircraft carrier, in my definition, is built around certain salient features, and these are the salient features. It has a flight deck that you use for landing airplanes, taking airplanes off, and maneuvering and parking airplanes. You've got a method of launch, and it can either be a bow ramp like this has. This is Kuznetsov, the Russian carrier. It can be a catapult. It can be just, you know, they take off vertically. It can be a rolling takeoff, but without a ramp. It has a large propulsion space to move this big thing through the water fast, and it's got a hangar deck that you use to repair airplanes. And depending upon what your doctrine is, maybe you store them there, maybe you leave them on the roof. U.S. doctrine has always been to leave the airplanes on the roof. Bring them down to the hangar bay when you need to get them out of the way and when you need to do significant repairs on them. But most of the time, you just leave them on the roof. And then the last thing is you need some way of getting them from the flight deck down to the hangar bay. You need elevators of some sort. And these days, almost everybody is standardized on deck edge elevators. Okay, so Patrick Ross says, from the science fiction standpoint, what constitutes a small carrier versus a large carrier? In certain franchises, every cruiser-sized ship can carry a couple of squadrons. And so, yeah, there it seems to be cut off there at the end. Let's see. But I can answer that question. And so the answer is yes. There's two questions buried in there. What's the difference between small and large? And let's talk a little bit about hybrids that don't have to have a flight deck. In my longer talk on this, I go into the fact that if you don't have to have the flight deck functions as a doorway between the sea and the sky, effectively, right? Airplanes fly through the air, and they have certain attributes, like they can have high speed by virtue of the fact they fly through the air. They can use altitude to their advantage by increasing their field of view. They can go very fast, and they can go long distance, but they can't do that for very long, right? So yeah, it can fly 1,000 miles, but it's only going to be in the air for 2 hours. Whereas an aircraft carrier can be at sea for months, if not years at a time. And, but it's going to be poking around at 25 knots. So, and it can carry a huge amount of stuff, whereas airplanes can only carry a little bit of stuff. And the hangar, the flight deck functions as the doorway between the sea and the sky. It's aircraft carriers are designed to have your cake and eat it too, to give you long endurance with high capacity. And then airplanes give you extreme capability. So, and if you don't need that flight deck, because you're in a science fiction setting and you're out in space and you can just sort of push a ship out the back, it's by no means clear to me that you would centralize all your assets that way. You might still do it for economies of scale purposes. Like if you got some particular piece of engine, like an engine test stand, right? Engine test stands are pretty big. They got a lot of specialized gear associated with it. That gear might be really expensive. You might have some special expertise in order to do stuff with that. You wouldn't want to have to put one of those on every ship. If you got an aircraft carrier, you've got like one on the ship, right? And the aircraft carrier can do all these other functions as well, which I won't get into the details of that because I said I wasn't going to. So I don't know what the difference between a small and a large aircraft carrier, space-going aircraft carrier is, right? What would make it small versus what would make it large? I'm not even going to try to answer that. What I'm going to try to do is go through the different things that makes that some of the interesting things about small versus large carriers in our universe, in the real world, and then try to relate that to how that might play out in science fiction. So last time when we were talking about the size of Starfleet, I kind of started off by saying I'm going to duck the question. I'm going to kind of duck this question too, because I think it really is one of those questions that depends upon what your baseline assumptions are going in. It's not really answerable in terms of I can't give you an answer, but I can give you my thoughts on how to think about the problem. And I can tell you right now, for instance, that I can tell you a story as to why battle stars make sense in Battlestar Galactica, in the Ron Moore version of Battlestar Galactica. I cannot tell you a reason why carriers would make sense in Star Trek. I can't make that work in my head because the technology assumptions are so different. And I can't reconcile, even without the stuff we see on screen, I can't reconcile it. So more on that coming up. I'm going to come. Yeah. Dustin says, everybody carries shuttle pods. Yeah. And so in some ways you can sort of look at it. You look at a Galaxy class. In fact, I got a picture of one coming up. You look at a Galaxy class, it's got 3 shuttle bays and one of them is just huge. I kind of look at that and go like, it kind of is a hybrid carrier, right? It's got a lot of capability and it's got a lot of space. It could have a lot more capability, especially when you got tractor beams. When you've got a high ceiling and tractor beams that could just sort of lift stuff over other things to move things around. Boy, I could pack an awful lot into that shuttle bay and I could still move stuff around. But I think they have as many shuttlecraft as they need. I think they just don't need very many. So in any event, we'll come back to that. Let's see, next slide. Okay, so let's do a couple of quick comparisons to give you an idea of big versus small here. And so what we've got here is, let me put it up on my bigger monitor. So I'm going to be looking up at the sky because I've got my monitor stacked and I'm looking at the bigger monitor so I can read numbers off. So the Ford and Nimitz classes are about 100,000 tons each, over 1,000 feet long. They carry about 80 aircraft. The study for CVNX, which was the one that became the Ford, talked about a 75 aircraft air wing. 80, 75 is about what they have. And then once you get to everybody else has a lot fewer on theirs. And so the Queen Elizabeth, 65,000 tons. It's almost as long, but it's not, can't go as fast, can't carry as many aircraft, does not have catapults in the same way. What it's got is a raised bow. It can have catapults. They built in the margin and they've got the space to put in a catapult if they decide they wanted to add it later, but for cost reasons, they didn't go with a catapult. The French carriers are even smaller, but you'll notice they carry about the same amount of aircraft as the Queen Elizabeth class does, and it's nuclear. And then everybody else is getting a little bit smaller. And, you see 80 aircraft for the Ford, and it could carry more if you really wanted to, but the sortie rate would go down. You get to a point where, because it gets crowded, the amount of flights you can do goes down. So why would you put more airplanes on? Well, if you expect to lose some, you might have spares on board, but you pay a price for having the spares on board. If you can fly the spares out if you need them, that's better. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But you look at the Chinese carrier that they show here, and this is a few years old now, but you look at the Chinese carrier in the two Kuznetsov variants, they can carry about 50 aircraft. You'll note they're the same size as the Queen Elizabeth, but they are the same displacement anyway, but they carry 10 more aircraft. Some of that's just doctrine. So that's what you get for the various types of, you can sort of think of those as large, medium, and small, with really only the US having stuff in the large category. So it's kind of medium, kind of starts with the Queen Elizabeth class in this drawing. So here's another drawing that's even older. Okay, let me readjust my screen and put stuff down on the screen so I'm looking more at the camera again. This is an older slide that has a couple of different carrier versions there, and it shows you the Kuznetsov, compares the Kuznetsov to the Nimitz class, to a couple of smaller carriers. And then on the right-hand side, that at the time that was done, which is 2005, 2010, that was all the aircraft carriers in the world. And you'll note that includes all the US amphibs. That's that first column. And then the second column is all the US large carriers. And then the third column is the entire rest of the world. And so if you included our amphibs, which many of our amphibs are bigger than other people's quote unquote carriers, that would double the size of the US carrier fleet if you included those as being carriers. So the US has gone all in on this. The Chinese look like they're going all in on this. And there's other people, like the Japanese, they had these aircraft carrying destroyers that they've been making the modifications to turn them into carriers that can carry the F-35. Now, the comment all along was sort of kind of like, yeah, it's a helicopter destroyer. Yeah, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Well, okay, it turns out it really was a helicopter destroyer because they've had to lengthen the ship by like 20 feet, and they've had to reinforce the flight deck because F-35s are heavier, and they've had to reinforce the flight deck with thermal materials because the F-35 exhaust is so much hotter. And so they're making a lot of physical changes. This is not the equivalent of we're just going to change the designation of the ship and now it's a carrier. They are bending metal and welding and doing a whole bunch of stuff and making lots of material changes to the thing in order to make it work. So, but more carriers out there, and small carriers. Okay, so here's some rules of thumbs about carrier capability. Anytime you want to get more capability, i.e. you want to carry more airplanes, you want to have bigger airplanes, you want to have faster airplanes, all those things basically lead to anything you want to do with the air wing is going to make the air wing bigger, either individually or total. The bigger the ship is, the faster it can move, which means the bigger the airplanes that can fly off of it, because it takes advantage of the fact that if you're moving into the wind at 25 knots, you've got a 25 knot wind over the deck. You're moving at 25, it's maybe adding another 10. There's actually limits on that. You don't want to get much above 25 or 30, because then at some point you have to worry about blowing your own guys over, right? There's 500 people out in the flight deck. You don't want to just knock them over, right? But if you're moving through the water and your plane has a takeoff speed of 150 knots and you're putting 30 knots over the deck, you only have to go 120 knots. It makes it easier. Makes it easier, means you can carry more fuel, ordnance, whatever. You spend less fuel taking off, so you've got a greater range. So any increase in capability really leads to wanting a bigger ship, because you need a bigger ship to go faster, to carry more stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Vertical takeoff and landing costs. It costs you in terms of the planes get more expensive, more complex to maintain. They have bring back requirements. They can't bring as much stuff back, so they have to expend the ordnance, even if they have to drop the ordnance, even if they didn't fire it. They're lighter when they take off. There's all sorts of issues associated with that. And large carriers are just more efficient because of moving stuff around on the flight deck. So my guess is on a Battlestar, a big flight pod is more efficient also, because it's easier to move stuff around on it. So those are the rules of thumb about it. Here's some differences not mentioned on previous slides. And cost savings of doing a STOVL carrier. So like, let's just say I'm going to do short takeoff and vertical landing, like F-35, right? I'm going to build the ship, and it's going to be, I'm not going to have arresting gear. I'm not going to have a catapult. I'm just going to have a bow ramp. But it's going to be the same size. What does that do to the cost? It's like 8%. It's really not that much. Catapult and arresting gear, compared to the rest of the size of the ship, the rest of the cost of the ship, it's not that much. So the cost savings are relatively modest for that. You would think that a 55 plane carrier would generate, like 55 75ths the number of sorties of a 75 plane carrier. That's actually not true. If the plane is sized to 55, the carrier is sized to 55 planes, it generates about half the sorties as the larger ship does. In fact, if you take 55 airplanes and put them on a carrier designed to operate 75 airplanes, you get 40% more sorties out of those 55 airplanes. So, because it's just so much easier to move stuff around if you got the space. So say you got 55 airplanes versus 75. What did those planes do? Well, you're going to lose a certain number of those to fixed cost missions, right? I've always got to have an AWACS up. If I'm going to have an AWACS up, airborne early warning, right? If I'm going to have one of those up, and I want to have it up, I want to do a 2-ship rotation on those, because I always want to have one in the air. So let's just say it can fly for 6 hours. I'm pulling numbers fairly arbitrarily, and I want to have it up 12 hours a day while we're flying. And so, I put one up for 6 hours, and then it comes down, and I got to put another one back up for 6 hours. So I need 2. I need 2 of those, whether I have 55 planes on this carrier or if I have 75 planes on this carrier. I've got to have a certain number of dedicated air defense. Likewise, doesn't matter how big the ship is, I still have to have the same number, right? Whether it's a 55 plane air wing or a 75 plane air wing, got to have the same number. So I'm going to lose a certain number of those. So where do those what's the extra? The extra is the strike mission. The extra is the ability to reach out and attack other ships and attack land targets, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got a certain number of fixed cost missions that are going to eat up a certain percentage or a certain absolute number, not a percentage. It's an absolute number. And if I have 55 planes, that fixed percentage is a fixed number, is a larger percentage than it is if I have 75 planes. I always got to pay the cost. Before I move on, I'd like to call your attention to the image below. That is USS Carl Vinson. When she came into the fleet in 1980, her call sign was Battlestar. It's now Golden Eagle. First, I don't know why they changed it. Battlestar was so much cooler. So let's talk about the implications for space-going carriers. Even if you don't need a flight deck, you still need to move your planes around, and you need mechanics in their gear, and you need to defend the ship. So you got to, and so you got to pay all those taxes, etc. So even if you don't need a flight deck, you still have to do a lot of the other functions of an aircraft carrier. And as a result, thinking about it as an aircraft carrier probably makes a lot of sense. Now, admittedly, if I distribute these functions, like say every ship has 5 vessels on it, then I can coordinate between them. Okay, maybe I can do that. But I still run into some economies of scales issues. And I think in the absence of the specific details of the technology assumptions and doctrinal assumptions, et cetera, details matter. But in the absence of those details, a lot of the rules that point towards a bigger carrier, I think probably apply to a science fiction carrier as well. And so you probably want to make it big, maybe. Now, I'll note, I am specifically making an implicit assumption that I'm now going to make explicit, that I'm using that carrier or that carrier-like capability kind of like I'm using a carrier now, right? If my model of combat says I'm not using it that way, right? Like if it's like the role-playing game Traveler, where fighters are a way of having small amounts of capability to deal with smaller targets and are not about dealing with mass strikes against enemy ships. Because in the Traveler universe, that's just going to get a bunch of people killed. And I would argue in Star Trek, that's just going to get a bunch of people killed to no end. Okay, then maybe a smaller carrier makes a lot of sense in that case, because I don't need to generate huge amounts of strike sorties. I only need to generate onesies and twosies to go off and do stuff. So it's interesting when you go back to World War II and sort of think about what the various types of fighters did in World War II. I'm not talking about the ocean stuff. I'm talking about the Air Force stuff. A heavy fighter will generally lose to a light fighter because a light fighter is so much more maneuverable. It'll just run rings around a heavy fighter. Heavy fighters weren't designed to fight light fighters. Heavy fighters were designed to shoot down bombers. And so a bomber is much more resilient against a light fighter than it is against a heavy fighter, because a light fighter has a lot lighter guns. If the biggest thing you've got is a 50 cal or a 20, if you've got a heavy fighter that's got nothing but 20 millimeter cannon, then it can do a lot more damage than even a plane armed with 50 cals and maybe one cannon, right? So you'd use light fighters to protect bombers, lighter fighters anyway. You start running into range considerations and how big you have to be, because you can't miniaturize fuel. How big you have to be to carry enough fuel to escort the bombers. So you start running into this thing where, I want to think about having light fighters to shoot down heavy fighters to prevent the heavy fighters from shooting down my bombers. And so I think that model has the potential. That's kind of the model that I see in something like Traveler. And you may recall, Traveler is on the list. I want to go through all the books that Martin Doherty has written for that, because Martin Doherty gets it. And I want to go through all the books that Martin Doherty wrote. And I'm going to spend about 5 sessions talking about Traveler and how it all fits together, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a lot of work, and I just haven't gotten it done yet. Okay, so more implications for space-going aircraft carriers. If you don't need a flight deck, hybrid things look better, right? Omega-class ships from Babylon 5. Most of the flight ops considerations no longer apply, although we're going to talk about an exception in just a minute. Most of those flight op considerations no longer apply. And why would you put all your eggs in the high-value unit basket if you didn't have to, right? Aircraft carriers are 100,000 tons. All of the escorts put together are about 50,000 tons, maybe. And so like all of your capabilities in the carrier, why would you put all your eggs in one basket if you didn't have to? Well, there's some reasons why you might do it, but it isn't going to be the flight deck. In the real world, carriers are defined by their flight deck, but they're not going to be defined by their flight deck necessarily in science fiction. That's foreshadowing again. I got a counterexample. So the details matter. In fact, speaking of the details, oh yeah, I forgot. Got to talk about Star Trek a little bit. So a Galaxy class is kind of that hybrid if you think about it, because it's got a lot of shuttle capability. It's got a big main shuttle bay, and then it's got 2 smaller ones that give it a lot of capability, and it could carry more stuff. So, okay, maybe that's your hybrid. Why don't we see more shuttle ops? And that's, I would argue, it's because in this universe they don't make sense to use shuttles as a weapons platform. Because, for a couple of reasons, shields are resilient. I'm unconvinced that a small ship has the phaser power or can even carry a big enough photon torpedo to meaningfully do a whole lot of damage to like the shields of a Galaxy class, a big ship like this. Shields are resilient, and phasers never miss. Now, people will say, well, cruise phasers do miss. Yeah, they miss about 60% of the time. Battleship main guns missed 93% of the time. Right? The hit rate on a battleship was 3 to 6%. And that's sufficient because when they hit, it left a mark. Right? A couple of hits can sink a ship. You were never in that situation in Star Trek. You have to beat the other guy's shields down. The exceptions to that are things where the Federation is way outclassed. The Borg are at the low end of way outclassing the Federation in that regard. And so for most of the stuff, there's no reason why you would want to have an armed shuttle because it's just not going to make a difference. There are perhaps some exceptions to that, like if you're dealing with the Maquis and they don't really have important, big warships, et cetera. For flotilla type missions, going back to Corbett, for flotilla type missions, a flotilla type ship might make sense. In that case, a Galaxy class would be wasted. But that's not the way it works most of the time. All right, so now I want to talk about specifically Battlestar Galactica. So first of all, let's set the scene a little bit. This is the scale of that ship. On the right-hand side, we have a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier next to the Yamato, and that's in her space battleship Yamato configuration. You can see the little fins on the back. But the Galactica is huge. It's got these huge flight pods. And so I just said that I didn't think that you needed a big flight deck. And I also specifically said that I thought that maybe Battlestar Galactica was the exception to that rule. So why do I think that this is an exception to that rule? And the answer is because I see hints of what the colonials were trying to do with this ship design. You see most of the hints actually in the miniseries. Remember, first of all, it's an old ship. Second of all, it wasn't fully equipped anymore, right? So it wasn't up to modern fleet standards, and it didn't have its full ordnance. It didn't have its full complement, et cetera, et cetera. It lost all of its modern fighters at the very beginning of the war. And we never saw the colonial fleet really implementing their doctrine, right? We never saw the fleet fighting as a fleet. We saw the fleet fighting as you know, this very beaten solo performer ship. We didn't see a fleet. We, you know, with the exception of when Pegasus was there, we only had one warship, right? And so we never really saw it do its thing, really, with one exception. And that was, there's a battle that it fights in the miniseries where you see the reason why you have these big flight pods. Well, you kind of get the impression for part of it. Part of the reason why I would argue it has this big flight pod is because they launch out of the sides, and it can pretty much put all of its Vipers into space almost simultaneously. It can get its entire air wing up right away. U.S. aircraft carrier can launch about 4 aircraft a minute. So if it's going to launch 60 airplanes, it takes a while to get them all in the air. And it can make that work because when it, like if it's doing an interception, you have a couple of airplanes that go out to do the interception, and then you call others up on deck to be ready to go as the second wave if you need a second wave. But in general, you're not sending, if you're going to be sending 40 airplanes, 50 airplanes, 60 airplanes, something like that, if you're going to be doing that, the situation that you're doing that is you're conducting a strike against land targets. You might be, if it's World War II, you might be conducting a strike against naval targets, but you're doing something offensive. You're not doing it for defensive purposes. I think most of the Vipers here are for defensive purposes, and they're trying to get as many out as possible. And so that's why that's one of the two reasons why they have the long flight pods, is because it lets them launch them all simultaneously. The other reason is the combat landing. And the last time I watched the miniseries, this was kind of an eye-opener, because the plan is they need to get everybody back on board as fast as they can, and then they're going to jump. They're going to retract the pods and they're going to jump. Okay. That's why you have this really long flight deck. One of the reasons why you have this really long open flight deck that's very, very tall. And that's because you see Vipers coming back in where there'll be a couple side by side and there's one up above. And I'd be willing to bet, and this isn't like a call the ball, you know, you're on approach, et cetera, et cetera. They're not landing one at a time. They are told, get back aboard. And this is basically something they're doing for themselves. They're not under traffic control at the time. The air traffic control just says, yep, you're good. And they all come rushing in. And so my guess is they have doctrine that says that if you come in at the top, you go to the far end before you land, right? My guess is they have zones. And they probably break it, it's triangular, so they probably break it into 3 sections. And if you come in on the lower left, you land here. And if you come in on the lower right, you land here. And if you come in here, you land. And the idea is we'll sort them out later, get them down on the deck, get the magnetic clamps in place, because this ship is about to leave. And if you're not locked in place when the ship leaves, you know, you might, it could be a bumpy ride. Right. So this strikes me as this is all about just getting as many Vipers on the ground as they can, as fast as they can. And so they build these huge flight pods. So there's plenty of room to have everybody land at the same time. They get everybody back on board in about 15, 20 seconds. A U.S. aircraft carrier can't do it that fast. It's got one set of arresting gear. It's got one runway. They land one at a time. And it takes about, you have to catch the wire, you go out, you pull out the wire, you disconnect the wire, you move off to the side, they reset the wire, next airplane. You can land, I think it's like every 20 seconds, if I remember correctly. 3 a minute, maybe 4 a minute. So these guys landed as many airplanes in about 30 seconds as a U.S. aircraft carrier takes like 15 minutes to land. And that was the last slide. So with that in mind, let me go through scroll back up to the top and see what we've got for questions. So if anybody's got any questions, toss them out. Let's see. Why did it take something like 200 years to even think up in spaceship carrier, the carrier class shuttle? So I have my own theory about the Akira class, and I also have some thoughts on the Miranda class, which is another ship that has a huge hangar bays, right? I don't want to make it sound like I think that hangar bays are not useful for Federation starships. I think they're very useful for Federation starships. I think you can use them for storage. You can have shuttles that have sensors. You can send shuttles places. You can do drive-bys of systems. You need to do a personnel transfer. I don't need to stop in that system. I got a shuttle. I'll just send a shuttle off, right? And at some point, somebody will bring a shuttle back to me, right? And so I think a lot of shuttles just sort of get passed around the fleet. I think that's kind of the way that happens. Eventually, they try to marry them back up again, but there's always a lot of traffic going back and forth. And I think in the case of the Akira, I think that they built something. So here's my personal theory on the Akira. I've talked about at least parts of this before. I have my own headcanon on the Akira. My headcanon on the Akira goes, the Akira was kind of a design study. Every now and then, Starfleet engineering, to keep their skills sharp, they do concept ships, right? And so they will do like, okay, what if we were to design a warship? And one of them was, what if we were to design a shuttle carrier? And I can think of all sorts of reasons why I might want a shuttle carrier like that. They're useful for exploration. They have a lot of, and maybe those big hangar bays, they think of it as a multi-mission bay. It can carry shuttles, it can carry storage pods, it can carry all sorts of things in a multi-mission bay, right? It doesn't have to be shuttles. What's the other attribute of the Akira? It's got a metric shit ton, 1,000 shit kilograms worth of photon torpedo tubes. And so I think this was a design they kind of had laying on the shelf with no intention whatsoever to build it. And then Jean-Luc Picard and the Enterprise encounter the Borg. And they come away from their encounter with the Borg going, there's a new threat. We didn't have to worry about the Klingons. We didn't really have to worry about the Romulans because they had sort of disappeared. But now we got this new threat we have to worry about. What are we going to do? Oh, by the way, they kind of ignored our phasers. They're really much better with shield harmonics and stuff like that than we are. They basically just made our phasers ineffectual. What do we do? And so there was two different pieces of that puzzle, two different solutions. One was we need to do a metric shit ton of research on increasing firepower and different things we can do. And so that included all sorts of nasty cyber stuff, but it also included things like quantum torpedoes and the like. And then there was another group of people that said, yeah, but what can we do now with off-the-shelf stuff? And somebody said, you know, the Akira design has a lot of space that we could put a lot of photon torpedo tubes in that. And maybe the solution, if we can't kill them with our phasers, maybe the solution is to make a really, really big boom right next to, you know, you're not doing shield harmonic stuff to deal with a ton of antimatter going off right next to your shield, right? That's just, let's just make a big boom. And so they built a ship that has something like 17 photon torpedo tubes. That's not an exaggeration. That's the order of magnitude it is. It's somewhere in the teens. And they point in all directions. So this is a ship that can shoot at a Borg while it's approaching it, shoot at it as it's going by, and then shoot at it again from the rear as it's going away. And then it can come around and do that again. And so I think the Akira, I think the shuttle bay was something that just sort of came along for the ride. I think the big thing was they built something that had a lot of photon torpedo tubes. You can maybe make the argument that they ignore small ships, and as a result, maybe we can do something with small ships. But the thing about the Borg is, you know, they ignore small ships because they don't think they're a threat. If you prove to them that they're a threat, they will stop ignoring the small ships. But, you know, maybe part of that also was like, you know, maybe I want to put out a big sensor net. Maybe I want to use them to drop mines. You know, maybe it's not really about fighters, it's about mine layers or something like that. So in any event, that's my thoughts on it. Okay, so scrolling. Yeah, Dustin says the new Battlestar didn't have energy beam weapons. I'm kind of, you know, the more important thing for me is not do you have something like that or not, but that you're consistent in how you approach things. If that milieu does not support energy weapons, it doesn't support energy weapons, and I'm okay with that. Talking about the main hangar bay. Kelvin USS Enterprise. Kelvin, I've never heard of that. What could that be? Sorry, I don't do Kelvin. How much larger will the new Enterprise be than the John F. Kennedy or the Gerald Ford? I don't think it's going to be any larger. I think it's going to be I think they're all basically the same hull form. And 1,100 feet is about the max of what you want to build an aircraft carrier at, because you start running into it's hard to make something that big, rigid enough and survivable enough. And, you know, yeah, we can make oil tankers, but they all handle like pigs, and you know, the stress is you as an oil tanker captain, you spend all your time trying not to put stress on the ship. As the captain of an aircraft carrier, you're constantly doing things that are going to put stress on the ship. I would not want an aircraft carrier that was 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet long. It would just be a pig. Whereas, believe it or not, I've never seen the Ford underway, but a Nimitz is surprisingly nimble. It's got a pretty tight turning radius. In fact, the main limitation on the turning radius of a Nimitz class aircraft carrier is the fact that you've got all this stuff on your roof. And if you take the turn too hard, stuff will slide off the roof. And so it's interesting when they do the trials, they don't have an air wing on board. They don't have any of that stuff on board. And they tell everybody in advance, hey, we're going to do some hardcore maneuvering. And when they do the hardcore maneuvering, they put a pretty good lean on it. And I've seen the photos of that, and you look at the wake in the background and you go, oh my God, that's a tight turn. That's a really tight turn for a ship that's that big. So an oil tanker takes forever to do a turn. An aircraft carrier has 4 screws and 2 rudders. And if you throw one set of screws into reverse and the other set of screws into forward, and you're twisting the ship with the rudders also, that thing will turn. Okay. Nuclear carrier is expensive to refuel and refit. Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things they talk about, is that you lose a couple of years to the complex overhaul. Like every 20 years, you lose like 2 or 3 years to just servicing the reactor. I believe that the Ford is designed to not have to do that. But because of that complex overhaul in the past, there was always there were times where you just lost it, right? So instead of having a 6-month overhaul, you'd have a 3 or 4 year overhaul. And whereas your conventional buddies are just doing a 6-month overhaul like normal. Okay. Yeah, any Navy fleet only moves at the speed of the slowest ship's maximum speed. That is true. Although usually you don't move at maximum speed because the fuel costs are a lot higher at maximum speed. And the other thing is, another reason not to move at maximum speed is that then if somebody needs to maneuver to change position in the formation, they've got no reserve, right? If everybody's moving at 30 knots and that's your maximum speed, and they say, okay, USS Umpty Frats, take the lead, how do you do that? Everybody's already moving at your maximum speed. Truck really only is runabouts. Yeah, that's we see some other shuttles. People keep coming up with things, and maybe some of those things that fought the Maquis, I think they're more like gunboats or corvettes, but maybe some of them would fit in a hangar bay. I'm not sure. But I also think, and I've said this in the past, I think if you've got these small things that you're using to fight the Cardassians, I think part of that was they were increasing fleet numbers in a situation where they were fighting a technologically inferior foe, and they knew they could get away with it. I don't see you doing this to fight the Klingons. And that's the other thing. Like, okay, if carriers made so much sense in this universe, the Federation doesn't do it. Klingons don't do it. The Romulans don't do it. If it makes sense in this universe, why isn't somebody doing it? And you can make the argument that maybe the Federation isn't doing it because it doesn't make sense for what they're trying to get out of their mission, right? Because I would argue they've got this mission that involves all this exploration, et cetera, et cetera. I think they don't build a separate war fleet usually. They make exceptions for things like the Borg, but they don't build a separate war fleet usually. What they do is they have an exploration fleet that can double as their war fleet when they need it. It's sort of like if every Coast Guard cutter had Aegis on board and Tomahawk. And then when you need to go to war, the Coast Guard goes to war in fights. But most of the time, the Coast Guard is just going out doing Coast Guard things. I think that's basically the model for Starfleet. And so I can point at that and say, okay, maybe space-going carriers make sense in this universe, but Starfleet makes a doctrinal decision not to build them. Do we think the Romulans are not going to build the kick-ass warship if indeed it is the kick-ass warship? Do we think that they're not going to build it because they're too focused on exploration? Do we think the Klingons are not going to build the kick-ass warship? Do we think the Cardassians are not going to build the kick-ass warship if it really is the kick-ass warship? That tells me that it is not the kick-ass warship in that universe. And so that's why I don't think they have carriers in that universe. One Horse Shay says Federation fighters work because other powers don't have 720-degree firing arcs. I don't think Federation fighters work as something that you would send after an enemy capital ship. I think they work against the Maquis. Like one of the things in Traveler, one of the things Martin Doherty does in Traveler is he specifically says most fighters are deployed in onesies and twosies. A fighter is a way that you add some firepower to a patrol ship that's they've realized that the pirates in that area are particularly nasty and they need a little bit of extra firepower. And so they add a fighter to it. And so I think in some of these universes, the right way to think about this is that your fighter or striker equivalent is not an F-35. It's not a Super Hornet. That's the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is it's an armed helicopter. So if you need to add some capability to a ship that can already handle a helicopter, you can, like I can add the ability to a Coast Guard cutter to have a helicopter that has a dipping sonar and can drop sonobuoys, and it can drop torpedoes. I just need to put a container on board the ship that has all the extra consumables, and I fly the helicopter on board. In fact, the Coast Guard flies the Jayhawk, I believe is the name of that particular version of the H-60, and the Navy flies the Seahawk. So similar, if not same engines, same sorts of flight computers, stuff like that. Mechanics can probably already fix it. Although they bring their own mechanics along, because you always do that. When you deploy the squadron, you bring your mechanics with you. Okay, so Patrick Ross says Yamato 2199 was interesting in how they used the lack of gravity for fighter storage economy. I don't even remember that. I think, is that the live action space battleship Yamato? If it is, I've seen it and I don't remember it. If it's not, then I haven't seen it. So Dustin asked the question, in transit, can the carrier move faster with no men on deck and everything tied up? Yeah, in fact, the biggest issue why you don't want to do that is because you want to have your escorts along with you, right? Because the aircraft carrier is not particularly good at defending itself against certain types of threats. Like it's not particularly good about defending itself against submarines, for instance. And so, but there have been times where we've said, we need a carrier there and we need it now. Go as fast as you can. Your escorts will catch up when they can. Because the old USS Enterprise, the claim was she was the fastest surface ship in the fleet when she entered the fleet, and she was the fastest surface ship in the fleet when she retired. Because that aircraft carrier was designed with a really fine hull form. Its hull was designed for speed. The Nimitzes were designed for cargo capacity. They were designed to, they had a much fuller, broader hull form. They were designed to be able to hold a lot of stuff. Enterprise was designed as a Greyhound, and she had 8 reactors. Now, 8 small reactors versus 2 large reactors. People say, oh yeah, speed, blah, blah, blah. That's why it had 8. No, I think it's because they had small reactors, so they used small reactors. They were comfortable with the smaller reactors. And also they weren't, if you've got 8 reactors and one of them is down, you've lost 1/8 of your reactors. If you've got 2 reactors and one of them is down, you've lost half your reactors. And a lot of times they will pass off from one reactor to another. That's normal on Nimitzes, right? It's not like everybody's running at full steam all the time. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And so they will pass things back and forth. But it's more likely in that case, you're not necessarily worried about, you might be worried about people being blown off the deck. If you don't have to maneuver and you're just going straight lines really fast, you can do that. You can do that. And there's already the case that if the weather's really bad, they tell you nobody's allowed out on deck. And they do that on small boys too. It's not just carriers. If the weather's really bad, you're not allowed to go outside. So, scrolling. How many lifeboats do carriers have? I don't know. Well, the short answer is 0. They've got like a captain's gig and stuff like that. They have life rafts that look sort of like capsules on the side, and they can just sort of pull a handle and they release them into the sea. And in theory, when they hit the ocean, they inflate automatically. They don't have lifeboats per se. As terms of life rafts, I don't know how many they have. I assume they have enough for everybody. I've never asked the question. Wing Commander is a good example of a space carrier. I've done a show on Wing Commander. Wing Commander is a guilty pleasure. There are so many things wrong in that movie. Oh my God, is there so many? I've done specifically talked about the movie. There's so many things wrong in that movie, but there's a lot of things about that movie that I really, really like. There's a lot of things that are right, but there's a lot of things that are wrong. Yeah, where did Voyager keep all the spare shuttles and extra Mark 6 photon torpedoes? Yeah, good question. Somebody did a YouTube video where the first thing they say is Chakotay reporting that they've got like 86 torpedoes and no way to make any more. And then the video shows every time in Voyager when they fired torpedoes and how many they fired, and it keeps a running count. And I think it's like at negative 150 or something like that when the show ends. So they didn't pay any attention to that. Yeah, it was magic. I agree. Yeah, Olive points out in space you're not limited. You can put your flight deck on the bottom and the guns on the top, and you can do all sorts of stuff. Yeah, you're not limited in terms of, on the one hand, you have to have 360-degree coverage on your fire arcs, but on the other hand, you can have 360-degree coverage on everything, right? So you can take advantage of weird spaces that might not otherwise be take advantageable. And if you look at the Pegasus, it's actually got flight pods that have an upper and a lower deck. And I don't know that we ever actually see this, but I think the gravity on the lower ones is 180 degrees off center from the upper ones, because they're triangular cross sections. So it's an inverted triangle underneath. So I think that if you're landing on the other one, you come in upside down, relatively speaking. That's just my guess. Okay. Why does the Akira always get class as an escort, a heavy escort class? I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, there is not a consistent framework for classifying ships in Star Trek. I just don't think there is. And even in semi-canon sources like games and stuff like that, I'm sure that they have different rules on this. I'm sure that if we asked one of the people that works for Star Trek Online, I'm sure that he could tell us what the rules are. But I don't think the show had rules like that. I think that Sternbach and Okuda had some idea about that. And I think that some of the secondary sources are contaminated by people that just don't get it. Like there's one particular public domain source book for the FASA Star Trek Combat Simulator game that had every different Federation ship type. And it's a hot mess. It really is. Because it had like 10 different types of cruiser. And most of them boiled down to, and special equipment to do the job. Well, you didn't really tell me what the job is. And just saying it's got special equipment that differentiates this thing with special equipment is differentiated from that thing with special equipment. And to the degree that it talked about the missions, a lot of the missions were dumb. They were just dumb. And it fit in the category of you wouldn't design a ship just to do that thing. Right? It was the functional equivalent of saying, I'm going to design a car to go to the grocery store. That's all I'm going to use it for. It's going to be optimized for going to the grocery store. It's going to have places to put all the groceries in sort of a fixed container. And, it's going to have the part of it's going to be refrigerated, stuff like that. And that's what it's optimized for. It's going to the grocery store. And that's its mission. And I'll have another car if I need to go to Walmart. Yeah, right. Sure. Doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. What is the difference between old school Galactica and Ronald Moore Galactica? I will get into that when I redo the carriers in space. I think I've talked about it previously in a previous episode. I generally don't like just pointing people back to previous episodes. I've made that comment before, that I continually come back to topics I've done previously because I think about the topic some more, and I think I've got something more interesting to say, and I'm sort of integrating it with the previous stuff. And also, I want this to be a show that you can just sort of show up and watch one episode. I don't want this to be a show where it's like, well, you're 100 episodes behind, and I'm going to refer to something in episode 98, and I'm not going to explain what it is. You just have to go watch it. No, I don't want to do that. Constantly got new people coming in all the time, right? I want it to be accessible. And so I will go ahead and talk about the thing again. And, frankly, I haven't had a whole lot of people say it like, I'm tired of talking about this subject. You need to do something else, right? Anytime I talk about carriers in space, people seem to enjoy it, and I get lots of questions. And, Dustin asks a lot of questions, and he's somebody who's showed up maybe 40 episodes ago, thereabouts, something like that, 30 episodes ago, and has been asking a lot of questions and stuff like that. And I don't want to just tell him to go watch all the other stuff. But that having been said, I did talk a little bit about that. I would argue that I'll talk a little bit more about it now. I would argue that the 1978 Battlestar Galactica was just taking World War II and filing the serial numbers off and just adding in space on the end, right? I can't look at that. It does not make any sense to me. Carriers in space like that does not make any sense to me. Especially, it would make more sense if they had some ship-killing weapons. Because the thing is, we talk about fighters on carriers, but fighters aren't the big deal. It's really strikers, strike aircraft, right? A fighter doesn't carry a torpedo or a bomb. Fighter carries machine guns. It's the torpedo bombers, it's the dive bombers in World War II that made the difference in terms of the ability to sink other ships, right? The fighters were just to protect your ship from those guys and to get those guys in. And, yeah, maybe if you're in the truck lagoon, you might use your 50 cals to strafe destroyers, but you didn't kill ships you wouldn't kill a carrier by firing your 50 cal at it, by pew-pewing it to death. Whereas in the 1978 Battlestar Galactica, you're pew-pewing everything to death. And that's just kind of dumb. The Ron Moore Galactica, I think that I've said tonight, I can make a story where I can tell you what the doctrine is. I think I can come up with a consistent doctrine that seems to work under what we think the assumptions of that universe are. It is not a doctrine that is consistent with our universe, and it does not just appear to be filing the serial numbers off and doing World War II in space and saying in space at the end of it all. I don't think that that's it at all. So that, I think, is the big difference there. Let's see. Let's see. And then some lunatic lands, 2 Vipers stuck together. Yep. So Dustin asked a very specific question about what Starfleet would consider about building a new Akira-based thing. No idea. Depends on what the writer's room wants. Yeah, Olive points out that an Akira class would be a really good lifeboat recovery station. Yeah, it really would be. So Patrick Ross says, why do I get the feeling that the Akira was designed by an Andorian? So that is a specific reference to the FASA role-playing game where Andorians, at least I believe that that's what he's referencing there, because in that game, Andorians were known for their love of photon torpedoes. And all the Starfleet ships in that game that came out of Andorian design bureaus and were built by Andorian yards were always photon torpedo heavy. And so let's see. Yeah, okay, I'll talk about this a little bit. There's a group of us that are going to play Star Trek Adventures, and who knows? I plan on taking a lot of notes, etc. So maybe you'll all get to hear about it if we ever get the game off. I'm going to play the tactical officer, and I'm an Andorian. And I specifically picked an Andorian because it's a photon torpedo heavy ship, and Andorians love photon torpedoes. And so I'm rolling with that entire ethos there. And in the backstory, he's a Wolf 359 survivor, and he's also the Starfleet operational expert on photon torpedoes. He literally wrote the tactics manual for the book, or for that ship. He wrote the book for that ship. And now he's getting the opportunity to go be a member of the crew. So the people running the game have a lot going on in their life. And so we'll see if that actually ends up happening. Okay. Yeah, somebody said the Fords are more nimble than they should be, but they still take a quarter mile to turn 90 degrees. I will note a quarter mile is 1.5 ship lengths. Is less than 1.5 ship lengths, right? Because it's 1,100 feet long. And so, you know, if a quarter nautical mile is like 1.5 ship lengths. So yeah, it still it's a big ship, so it needs a lot of space, but it can turn surprisingly tight. Yeah, carriers are limited in what they can do. They don't run maximum speed usually. Although sometimes when they're on the downwind leg, because they're trying to get back into position so they can get back in the wind, they have a tendency to crawl upwind because they're doing flight ops, and then they'll turn around and sprint down the other direction with the wind, and then they turn around and crawl up. In fact, the thing about carriers is you can just look at the radar display and watch the replay and go, yeah, that's an aircraft carrier. It's acting like an aircraft carrier. I'm not telling you anything that the entire rest of the world hasn't figured out, like all the bad guys. Okay, there's a little bit of a discussion here about birds of prey and stuff like that I'm kind of going to skip over. I did not remember Romulans having PT boat tenders. I like that idea because I've previously talked about. This is one I will refer people to go back to. I spent a lot of time talking about torpedo boat carriers because the French actually built one. The French actually built one back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They built a torpedo boat carrier, and it was a test ship, and it succeeded as a test ship. It succeeded as a test ship. Ran into all the problems that torpedo boats always run into. Plus, these were very early torpedo boats, so they were really crappy torpedo boats. But the big problem with torpedo boats is that torpedo boats look better on paper than they do in the real world because the real world has weather, including waves, and all that stuff gets in the way. Torpedo boats actually look a lot better in space than they do on the surface of an ocean. So I'm a big fan of torpedo boat carriers. Okay, so there's a lot of specific discussion here. Randall Wong says people serving on CV-65 would have stories of the ship making an emergency run someplace outrunning the escorts. Yeah, other carriers have done that too, but yeah, the Enterprise in particular could do it at will because it was such a fast ship. Now, I don't have an official speed number for it, and I don't have an unofficial speed number for it. And I don't have an actual. I've heard stories about how fast the Nimitz can go. Those stories, incidentally, are classified. So I'm not going to share the details of the stories, but I will tell you that I discovered at one point, my first trip at sea, at one point, we were booking We were going someplace fast, and the ship is actually shaking. And I look at the TV monitor, and it says we're going like 30 knots, 32 knots. Okay. But we were doing that earlier, and it wasn't shaking. Same speed as we were doing earlier. It wasn't shaking then. It's shaking now. What's going on? Like a day or two later, I made some comment to somebody more experienced, and he said, well, that number lies. It's like, what? It's like, yeah, the number they put on the televisions, because they had this like closed circuit television that you could just sort of dial into from your stateroom. The number on that had like your lat long and this and that, and, you know, just a general stats page, right? It was your GPS stuff, you know, that type of information. It's like that lies. It never goes above. It doesn't matter how fast you're going. It never goes above like 31 knots, whatever the number was. They said there's a real speedometer, and he took me into. We were in combat. We were in the undersea warfare module in combat. He took me out to the ship's module in combat, where the ship's TAO sets, and he pointed and said, see that right there? That's the real number. That will tell you how fast we're actually going. Oh, okay. And we never went in. That was like of the 87 days at sea, of which about half were on aircraft carriers, we never got to the point ever again. This was like on day 5 of the 40 days I spent on aircraft carriers. And I was never in a situation where the ship shook again. So I never got to see what the real number is. But even if I had, I couldn't tell you. Okay, still scrolling, almost at the end, I think. Yeah, Olive says, I also think the CGI guys didn't understand what the Akira was designed to be when they put them in battles. Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. And the other thing is, we run into this all the time. Like, how big is a Peregrine? How big is that Maquis ship? You know, and all the things derived from it. I think the Peregrine and the Maquis ship were the same. But in any event, the thing that started off as that Maquis ship, how big is that thing? And the answer is it varied tremendously based upon how big they needed it to be. And so same thing you saw with the Defiant. The Defiant was sort of vaguely changing scales all the time. Saw the same thing in Babylon 5 with the White Star. White Stars started off really, really small and ended up being like destroyer size, or, you know, small cruiser size. They ended up being big ships, and they started off as very small ships. Same thing with, there's one other one that I'm thinking of that the same thing happened with in Star Trek. And the Bird of Prey. In fact, the Bird of Prey in the movies was famously so flexible in terms of exactly how big it was that when FASA did the ship recognition manual, they actually included 3 different birds of prey of different sizes. And the idea was that the Klingons had just scaled it up. So there was like a destroyer version, there was like a Corvette version, a destroyer version, and a cruiser version of that ship. And that was their way of solving the on-screen incongruity of how the size was treated. So, okay, let's see. Discussion about exosets on Peregrines. Okay, roger that. Oh yeah, the rotating rack in Yamato. Okay, that's sounding familiar. I would really like to know about that game system. Yeah, we're just going to play. We're just going to play Star Trek Adventures, which is the Modiphius system. Somebody once, I can't remember where I saw this online, but somebody once said, you can do a really good Star Trek game with a really set of simple rules that goes like this. If you're playing a Starfleet character, it goes like this. They're pretty much good in everything because it's competence porn, right? So they're pretty much good in everything. There's one thing that you'd think that they're good at that they're not. So pick something that you're just bad at, despite the fact that you should be good at it. And then there's one other thing that you're surprisingly good at that's totally unrelated to the fact that you're a Starfleet officer, like you're a gourmet cook or something like that. And then the last thing is that you have some sort of catchphrase, and if you use your catchphrase, you get like a +3 to die rolls or something like that. I forget what that last one was. But that in terms of sort of describing Star Trek officers, it's like, yeah, they're surprisingly good and they're surprisingly about most things, etc. And for the character that I was creating for this Star Trek game that we haven't started playing yet, for my Andorian character, if you've read the FOSSA rules, the other character trait that Andorians have is that they're really into knife fighting. That's their thing, is knife fighting and photon torpedoes. And my guy is fantastically good at photon torpedoes, and he absolutely sucks at knife fighting, and it bothers the shit out of him. It really, really seriously bothers him that he's not good at knife fighting. And he's an Andorian who's very pro-Federation. And so most Andorians look at him very suspiciously because he's pro-Federation. And most Starfleet officers look at him suspiciously because he's this militant Andorian. And so he's kind of like, caught between both worlds. So he's basically a geek. So we've all been there, right? Let's see. Scrolling. Yeah, somebody made the comment that you can almost always squeeze a little bit more out of something right up until complete failure. Yeah. I knew a guy who blew an engine in a Porsche one time. He just wanted to see how fast it could go. And he found out exactly how fast his Porsche could go. Okay, so I have reached the end. We're at the 90-minute mark, of which like the last half hour has been questions. So the presentation was the presentation was about right on time, and then these are good questions. So thank you as always, and as always, I am always constantly amazed at how many people are willing to come and spend their Saturday night listening to me talk. And so I really appreciate that fact. And as long as people keep coming and listening to me talk, I'll keep doing this show. So I thank you very much, everybody. And like I said, I don't think there's going to be a show. The only chance where there's a show next week is if the weather is going to be bad between here and Ohio. And I will make the call like probably on Thursday is my guess, is when on Christmas Day, I'll make the call as to whether I'm going to do a show on Saturday. So, check YouTube. And thank you very much, everybody. And I'll see you 2 weeks, maybe. Thank you very much. Bye.